quality of a Fire Emblem map can be separated into 5 different factors. Flavor, how well the map matches the story and atmosphere that it is trying to portray, and whether or not it succeeds at making you feel like you're really experiencing the story as the developers intended. Objective, what the map is asking you to do in order to finish the chapter, be it seizing, routing, escaping, or defending. Is it offering you an objective that is interesting to work towards? Replayability, you finished the chapter, now how do you feel about it? Frustrated? Relieved? Satisfied? There's any number of possible outcomes that can occur after finishing a chapter, so consider whether or not you'd enjoy playing the chapter again on a subsequent playthrough. Difficulty. Difficulty might not be an important factor for everyone, but a fair amount of players yearn to be challenged by Fire Emblem, to be given a puzzle to solve with the resources provided. Was the map that you just finished difficult in a compelling way? Enjoyability. Plain and simple, is the map fun to play? Are you having a good time whilst playing it, and if so, are you able to articulate exactly why the map is so stimulating? When all of these variables are managed effectively, what you're left with is an incredibly satisfying chapter to play through, providing a memorable experience for the player that they'll hopefully be excited to enjoy again during a second playthrough. And if you don't pay attention to this formula, what you're given is some of the worst the series has to offer. My name's Blute. Welcome to F.O.R.D.E. And welcome back to another episode of F.O.R.D.E. Oh my goodness, episode 12. We are rollicking through these 400 some episodes. We'll be done in 8 years. Don't worry, folks. I'll be here until the end of time, until I'm a very old man. But first, and most importantly of all, this week we will be tackling an FE4 map, a game I'm not the most familiar with, I am not particularly fond of, but I can respect FE4 in a lot of ways. It did a lot of things for the series that I can definitely, admire and respect. Excuse me, it's hot in here, I'm getting naked. Ignore the nudity. But overall, I think FE4 is a very mixed game, and I actually haven't finished it. The furthest I've gotten is to Chapter 8 in the second gen, like the equivalent of Chapter 3. You know what I mean, I got to the second gen at the very least. But regardless, we still will be talking about FE4, and the chapter we'll be talking about will be none other than the anagram that you probably solved last time of hit to flaky highborn, as when you rearrange those letters, you get birth of a holy knight, or birth of a crusader. The wiki told me it was birth of a holy knight. I know the title card said crusader. Crusader and holy knight are basically the exact same word. It's just synonyms, people. Give me a break. AKA prologue of FE4. You might think it's a little bit weird to review Chapter 1 of a game, but my idea for FE4, and I think this is actually kind of nice, is that this will effectively be the way that I finally complete FE4, is through reviewing each chapter in order for FE4, i.e., when we are finished with this episode, the next chapter we'll review for FE4 will be Chapter 1, and then Chapter 2, and so on and so forth. You can count upwards, you understand. I just thought that'd be a really novel idea for me to finally have a way and like an interest and a real reason to finish FE4, because I've fallen off of it so many times, and I really think I should just get myself in gear and actually, do the final push and finish the fucking game for once. Let's get into the categories. Now, I've been getting a little bit bored of just doing F-O-R-D-E in order, so let's go ahead and just arbitrarily mix up the categories, because that keeps things interesting. So let's start with replayability, because I feel like replayability always gets like the bad end of the stick, so to say. Alright, starting with replayability. This is most likely the only category that I'm going to be somewhat indecisive on, as while the chapter does have its fair share of issues when it comes to how fresh it can feel with every playthrough, it almost feels unfair to heavily dock points for lacking variation, since it's literally the first chapter. This is your first introduction to the world of Jugdrawl. Like I've said in other videos, it will feel pretty bizarre to have the beginning of your story have such wildly differing experiences between players, so making something that can seem somewhat simple in comparison to a lot of the later chapters in FE4 is both the correct choice for easing the player into the game's mechanics and vast story, as well as just making a less frustrating map overall, in my opinion. FE4 definitely does get complex with its later maps. It's not like the game stays simple for very long, so I do actually appreciate having a somewhat simpler map to start. In regards to how this chapter specifically deals with replayability, it's obviously going to be very static and unshifting in how you complete the map, as Birth of a Holy Knight has a very straightforward objective and set of side objectives to complete, along with a set 9 units that will be accomplishing the same tasks in the same way pretty much every single playthrough. I.e., Lex and Azel are pretty much always going to be dealing with the villagers being plundered on the top side of the map, since they spawn up there and are absolutely the quickest way of dispatching those bandits. Again, I don't really have a problem with this, as due to this effectively acting as the tutorial for FE4's mechanics, in a certain way. It's not done the most effectively in portraying like all of the mechanics in FE4, but like portraying how villagers are going to be an important factor in like basically every single map in Genealogy. I'd actually say it's a good thing that the devs are teaching the players how to rescue these villagers with a very simple method, and not really allowing them to use any of their other units, as that could lead to potential frustration, since the player could like misjudge the travel time, since it's early on in the game and you don't fully like understand the feel of each unit yet, or how far you can move them, stuff like that. So they could potentially misjudge the travel time from village to village and miss out on gold, which isn't the most like horrific of punishments, but it can still feel a bit frustrating. That was a really long and unnecessarily verbose way to say that I think keeping this chapter like really nice and tight and simple is actually a good thing. Now, outside of how you're completing those side objectives of the villages, which are pretty much that's basically it for the entire map. The primary core of the chapter of moving from castle to castle and aiding Medea along the way also stays fundamentally the same. Sure, the units you use to kill bosses and feed XP to may differ depending on how experienced you are with the game at this point, but ultimately, it's likely going to be Sigurd stomping through the fields reminding brigands of the importance of the weapon triangle, and how being a pre-promote that doesn't receive any experience penalty is completely fucking broken. Seriously, if you are unfamiliar with Genealogy, you've maybe heard of Sigurd and how he's like arguably the strongest unit in all of Fire Emblem, and the only thing holding him back is the fact that you only get to use him for half of the game. And I would stand by that statement. I think Sigurd is comically fucking broken. You think of units like Seth and Titania, it's like, whoa, these units are incredibly powerful, like fucking stallions in their field, and then you get to Sigurd and it's like, oh Christ, this is why horses were banned. But yeah, that's kind of it for replayability, as I stated. I'm absolutely in favor of the chapter almost putting, like, safety bumpers up for the very start of the game, like safety bumpers and bowling, if you're familiar with that, and allowing the player to experiment more as the chapters pass by, when you get to stuff like Crisis in Augustria, and that's the only other chapter I can name in FE4, that's how familiar I am with it. By making it so they're allowed to experiment more in later chapters, but keeping Birth of a Holy Knight relatively simplistic by design, is actually both the correct decision and done pretty effectively. It's strange that I'm saying the chapter doesn't have much replayability, and I'm giving the category a success because of that, but genuinely, like, the lack of replayability does wonders for how the chapter plays. It keeps it really nice and compact and, like, well designed. It's not just filled with a bunch of bloat, like a lot of, well, basically like every other fucking chapter in FE4. But that's 9 later videos. We'll get to them. Anyway, not what I expected, but here we are. Replayability definitely gets a pass. What category next? Let's go on to difficulty. Why not? Difficulty second. For difficulty, a lot of people will immediately clamor to the idea that FE4 isn't actually a difficult game, and that this category should basically be an immediate fail. A sentiment which I actually very much disagree on. Now, it's true, FE4, the majority of the time, is an extremely simple game, offering very little in terms of difficulty or surprises for the player. Most of Generation 1, and like a good chunk of Generation 2, is just steamrolling through the hordes of axe and lance units with your merry band of soldiers, and your edged weapon of a main lord. But that being said, I wouldn't call FE4's difficulty pathetically easy, I'd call it inconsistent. FE4 is an incredibly simple game in terms of how its maps are presented, like despite the fact that they are obviously much larger than your average map in Fire Emblem. It's mostly just melting through legitimate hordes of enemies, like 20 calves, like I think of Beowulf's squad in Chapter 2, or even here in Prologue, with the myriad of bandits who are just waiting to become, like, level up progress. However, on occasion, FE4 will decide that it's bored of playing fair, and having lulled you into a false sense of strength and security, decide to jump scare you with some outlandishly strong enemies. Now, these are usually in the form of bosses, like Bloom from Chapter 7 with his Mjolnir tome, and he becomes unbelievably accurate and very, very difficult to fight. But sometimes they take the shape of bolting mages in Chapter 8, who also have Adept, because Karga really, really didn't want me to finish FE4. Seriously, that is why I stopped playing on my most recent playthrough. I got to those Adept bolting mages, one of my critical units got fucking Adept boltinged which is something that I should never be allowed to say. That should be a sentence that is outlawed by the Geneva Convention. But yeah, that happened to me, and I just said, nope, I'm done. I don't think I would like to play anymore. Regardless, I am extremely grateful that Birth of a Holy Knight does not fall into this category of random heart rate pumping enemies just appearing out of thin air, and is instead a very simple affair of mostly weak enemies, with the occasional boss who will potentially take an additional turn to defeat. Again, it's the first chapter, so I am perfectly comfortable with most of the enemies being easy to deal with. I would much rather have like a traditional upwards difficulty curve for your game than one that starts with the early game being unbelievably difficult and the late game being piss easy. I'm looking at you, FE6. By just having very simple groups of enemies to deal with, it does create just a very nice, comfortable chapter to go through. In fact, I would say the majority of the difficulty in Prologue comes from having to think a little bit on how exactly you're going to rescue the villagers scattered across the maps, especially the farther away ones. While the game does give you plenty of time to do so, and they're not really a threat, it creates enough of an illusion of one that I think this category is also going to be a success, albeit not a particularly exciting one, and not a particularly strong one. I'd say it's like a C+. This is probably one of its weakest categories. I just say, nice, wholesome bandit slaughtering for the whole family. That's what this chapter comes down to. This chapter's about family, and that's what's so powerful about it. Now moving on to O, objective. We've got F.O.R.D.E. F.O.R.D.E. Objective. It's the prologue, and the objective is going to be incredibly simple, and that's fine. FE4 has pretty much the exact same objective across every single chapter, that being to seize the respective castle in whatever region you're in order to advance the plot. You repeat this until the chapter is over, so that you can do the exact same thing next chapter. This is fucking riveting stuff. Okay, I'll stop. I'm not personally the biggest fan of this setup, as I think the overly large maps can become really tedious to traverse as the game progresses, but I actually think it works reasonably well in the prologue. First off, the map isn't comically large. It's actually like a reasonable size in relation to the amount of objectives that it's asking you to complete, meaning that there is surprisingly very little dead space on the map where there isn't anything going on. If there appears to be an area where there isn't many enemies or allies, it's likely that there's a village for you to go and rescue, or a castle for you to seize. Stuff like that. Furthermore, the space in this chapter is really effectively utilized with the recruits you get in the first 3 turns, namely your main group, Lex and Azel, and Quan's brigade, all having their own little purpose on the map. Sigurd's group is your main offensive force, they're tasked with plowing through most of the enemies, Lex and Azel will clean up the brigands up top, and Ethlin will act as your much needed support for the main group. It feels really nicely and intricately planned out, and gives each of your units a purpose on the map. I do not feel like I'm wasting anyone, outside of Arden, but that's a different story. He's purposefully designed to be a joke. 8 out of your 9 units really do feel like they are doing something important on the map, which is excellent. Just the fact that the map feels really tightly designed with where enemies are placed and how villages are presented, and how it doesn't feel like it's wasting my time with turns that are dedicated exclusively to travel time, is enough for me to give objective a pass. Really, like, masterfully done prologue. I'd probably argue one of the strongest chapter 1s in the series in terms of objective. Let's do enjoyability last. I always kind of like ending with enjoyability, just a nice little opinion piece. So our 4th category will be flavor. The flavor for your first chapter is always going to be kind of awkward, as at this point you haven't had any prior chapters to establish any story beats or emotional drama. Literally all you know about Jugdrawl at this point has come from the opening text crawl that gives you all of the info about, like, the various territories and all of their respective leaders and some such, but that's it. Therefore, the overall goal for your flavor in your first chapter should be to just set the stage as effectively as possible. This means introducing your characters in a fun and memorable way, as well as potentially including a threat for the player to take into account. And wouldn't you know it, Birth of a Holy Knight does both of these extremely well. First off, as I said in Objective, the way this chapter introduces your playable units is done so wonderfully. It's genuinely some of my favorite recruitments in the series. FE4's recruitment theme is so goddamn good. It's one of the best in the series. So having it play in the background as all of your various allies come to Sigurd's aid is just, it's excellent. It's really great stuff. A really positive beginning note for a story that is otherwise pretty dire in terms of, like, tension and mood. Furthermore, the chapter introduces both of its minor threats for the chapter, with Verdane's bandits kidnapping Ideen, acting as, like, the villain of the week, in a sense. But it also reveals its overarching antagonist, with Arvis appearing towards the end, gifting a silver sword to Sigurd. Now at this point, if you have no outside knowledge, you don't actually know that Arvis is the main villain, but just by the way that he enters the battlefield with his really, like, imposing and menacing theme, you can tell that something's off with this guy. It's a really great introduction for a really great antagonist. Really, really sinister. Despite the fact that you don't actually know if he's doing anything wrong at this point. But you can tell something's up with him. Yeah, seriously, this chapter just oozes with flavor from every corner. Your units are introduced really effectively. The story isn't hyper convoluted, which is good for an opening chapter. And the dialogue doesn't feel like overwhelming in its quantity. It feels really nicely spread out throughout the chapter. Like I said in a lot of other chapters, I like it when dialogue is really nicely scattered, rather than just having a bunch at the start and a bunch at the end. I've been replaying through Awakening recently. Awakening does that a lot, where it's just a bunch of dialogue at the start and a bunch of dialogue at the end. It's really fucking dull and tedious. The other categories so far have had some somewhat weaker parts, but I think the chapter succeeds on every aspect in terms of flavor. I would legitimately give this category an A+, just pretty much perfect. Now moving on to E! Enjoyability. Enjoyability as a category, as always, is going to be both opinionated and kind of vague in how it's actually graded. This time, I think the overall fun of the chapter is going to come from how effectively the chapter acts as an introduction to the game as a whole. Not as a tutorial, in a sense, but like how much fun the player is having by moving all of their new toys around and exploring their new environment of Jug Draw. And I think in regards to that criteria, the chapter absolutely smashes enjoyability. You're given plenty of options to complete the chapter with, varying wildly in terms of strength, which could be viewed as a negative point balancing-wise, but there's definitely people out there who want to play with John Armonite, and only John Armonite, so I'm glad Ardent is, like, objectively awful, so those people can have a really good challenge run. Good variety of weapon types, not too complex with the amount of enemies or enemy placement, and most importantly of all, we haven't had enough time for the player to get sick of the needlessly massive maps yet. Have I mentioned it enough times yet? Are you sick of this complaint yet? Might seem a little strange, but I'm going to give enjoyability a pass as well. And that is going to wrap it up for this week's episode. Would you believe it? Our fucking season finale. We have our very first perfect chapter, with Birth of a Holy Knight successfully managing to pass every bit of criteria in each category, making for an undeniably satisfying chapter. It coincides story and gameplay effectively, it doesn't challenge the player too much for an introduction, and it actually respects the player's time. Unlike the rest of FE4, I'll never stop complaining. Give it up for Sigurd, everybody! The rest of the chapters will not be getting perfect scores when we eventually get round to them. And that is going to wrap it up for F.O.R.D.E for now, guys. I really hope you enjoyed our 12-episode extravaganza. We will return at some point, almost certainly, but I think for the next few weeks, I will just try and focus on something else, or perhaps just take a little break. I'm feeling quite kind of like, I'm going to be completely honest, I want to be straightforward, like just as straight and real with you guys as I possibly can. I'm pretty burnt out with Fire Emblem at the moment, so I'm probably just going to take a little break, like a few weeks, maybe a month. And then we will return with more content. Oh, man. I don't really know how to end this. I'm so used to ending with an anagram. So, I will just say... I will say this. For next time, please give me recommendations for new mystery... or just Mystery of the Emblem chapters and Awakening chapters, because those are the two games that I'm both least familiar with, because I've only finished New Mystery once, and I've only finished Awakening once. So I'm very unfamiliar with this game. Despite the fact that I haven't finished FE4, I'm actually far more familiar with FE4. So when we come back, we will do Awakening and New Mystery, and then we will have done one chapter from every franchise, or one chapter from every game, and then we can go buck wild and actually fucking do repeats, which sounds fun. Sounds good. But either way, that is going to wrap it up for this one. No anagram this time, guys. I just want you to have a nice, calm, relaxing evening. And I hope you're all very well, very warm, very comfortable. And I hope you will have a wonderful autumn. And I hope to see you soon. I hope my burnout only lasts like a week and then I'm back. Just like, hey, surprise! But either way, have a great existence, everyone. I will catch you next time. Whenever the next time may be, I'll be there. Right. See you around, everyone.